Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Many thanks to Faisal and the others here at the college for the kind invitation. It's my first time here to this premises. It's very beautiful. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep you all ever successful and ever protected here.
Amen.
The title of this talk, for those who saw the poster, was rather long. Hanafi this, Hanafi that, all these Hanafi things we're going to be learning about, to the extent that it kind of seemed almost, or it is impossible really, to do justice to all of that. So the key word is going to be introduction, which is the first word of that title. I hope that today we can lay some useful, interesting, meaningful foundations to understand this, I'll call it fascinating for now, fascinating school of thought. And I'm happy to take any questions, obviously, afterwards as well. The word Hanafi, obviously, is an adjective in Arabic from the name of Abu Hanifa, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. We use it to describe schools, Hanafi school, or books, maybe Hanafi texts. We might have Hanafi colleges. We have Hanafi scholars, Hanafi judges, Hanafi muftis. So it's a versatile adjective. But what unites all of these? The school, the texts, the scholars, the judges, the muftis. What unites all of them is a particular other adjective, which I'm going to call today Hanafi thought. When you look at the schools of law, the madhabs, we've classically in English always translated them as schools of thought. And I consider this a very meaningful translation. Because at the heart of calling them a school of thought is that what separates a school of law from another isn't just that they happen to have a different statement of law, but it's that underpinning all of their legal statements are particular ideas. What it means to produce law, how do you produce law, what are the sources of law, and so on. And so every school of law, to be given justice, we have to pass beyond statements of law and try to crack what is the thought of each of these. Each of these schools of thought, if we were to separate them, we'd say, oh yeah, they disagree on this question and this principle and that principle and this rule of Arabic and that rule of, the list can go rather long. But I think it's quite meaningful to say, if you step back a bit and group things together, there are two fundamental questions, two fundamental spectrums to answer two questions, which are the real difference between each of these schools of thought. Each of them had to answer them, each of them answered them distinctly, and each of them built a thought system out of that. What are the two questions? The first question is, what is authoritative tradition? This is the first question. Why is this the first question? Because Islamic law isn't something created in a vacuum in the minds of men. Its grounding, what makes it valid, is that it ties back to something sacred in the past. It's built on something which is gone. What is that sacred past? It's the past that connects to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam, who's the source of the sacred law. There are many ways you can connect to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Every school of thought had to have a commitment. What is the strongest way? What is the correct way through which we connect to that past? What is authoritative tradition? Each of them has a distinct answer. The second question, which each of them were forced to answer, otherwise they could not function as schools of law and schools of thought, is, what is the role of the human mind? That's your second question. There cannot be a school of law without the human mind. That's why in the early period, the jurists used to not make much of the hadith narrators. They narrate hadiths, but they were too scared to do anything from themselves. So the jurist would say, well, you guys can't help anyone because you don't have anything of your own to give. Because you have to combine the statements of hadith and actually produce a system if you're going to be producing law. So every school of thought had to have an answer. What is the role of the mind? Where does it start and where does it stop, and what do you do with it? So the Hanafi school then has a very clear answer to each of these two questions. And to understand that answer and to know how to discern it from their texts is what it means to be literate in Hanafi thought. To understand it, to live it, to learn it, to train it, to imbue it, and to bring it somewhere, wherever you might be living and acting. And I believe if we are not conscious of their answer to these two questions, we will read book upon book upon book, but the thought is going to evade us. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. What are in brief, the two answers they give to these two questions? I'm going to give a very simple answer to each of these. The first one, what is authoritative tradition? Abu Hanifa is an inheritor of the very early circles of knowledge. He was born 80 years after the Hijrah. He died 150 years after the Hijrah. And so he's inheriting the very early approach to this question of what is authoritative tradition. So the question is, what was the early approach? In this early approach, Sunnah wasn't simply a reference to hadiths. Sunnah was the correct religious practice that's come from the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But how do you get to it? It was seen as the teachings of those who kept the close company of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So you couldn't separate the word Sunnah from the word Sahabi. And the word Sahabi was meant with its real meaning of suhbah, which means the people who really kept close company. Not just people who might have met him once and went on their way, which is the Sahabi according to the Ahlul Hadith, but people who really had real company. They spent a long time with the Prophet ﷺ. After the Prophet died ﷺ, they were the teachers of the Sunnah. Let's take an example. Let's look at Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. You will all agree with me that he had an incredibly long and profound suhbah, kept a long company with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. How many hadith does he narrate in the form of I heard the Prophet say sallallahu alaihi wasallam and a quotation? Very, very few. Very, very few. But is that all he left us? No, he left us many things. His answers to questions. His decisions to undertake particular battles for particular reasons, his arguments, people who kept his company. All of that religious knowledge, where did it come from? It came from the Prophet ﷺ. So in the early community, then Sunnah is part of these people. You can't separate it very easily. That's really important. These people were sent off to the lands, especially in the time of Umar radiyallahu anhu. And each of the main centers of Islam, and the main ones grew to be 5, the main intellectual centers of Islam, because they became to be main political centers of Islam, which was Kufa and Basra in Iraq, loosely what they call Syria, which includes your Damascus and your Beirut, and then your Mecca and Medina in the Hijaz. These are the 5 political centers and knowledge centers in this early period. Kufa being central to us because that's Abu Hanifa's town. Each of these had main teachers from the Sahaba, from the people who kept company. You'd be surprised. Kufa you think of as far off in Iraq. How can that compare to Medina where the Prophet ﷺ lived? But what's fascinating is that Kufa was an Arab settlement. It had no life before Islam. It wasn't like an Iraqi town Muslims came to. It was not a town. It was a garrison. It's where the Muslim armies made their town. It was a camp from which they did their campaigns, and it developed into a town. So it was the only residents then were the Arabs who came from Arabia. And they say that really fascinating numbers. About 70 of those who fought in Badr lived in Kufa. About 1,500 companions of the Prophet ﷺ with the larger meaning of companion, settled in Kufa. Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu made Kufa his capital. There were disputes in his caliphate. He wanted to take them out of the Hijaz and out of Medina, and he settled himself in Kufa. So Kufa is quite fascinating then, as a center of pure Arab tradition, therefore, not of any local culture from Iraq, and a deep settlement of some very great companions. And obviously the most famous teacher was Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, one of the earliest converts to Islam, and someone who stood out from all the other senior companions in that he wasn't involved in politics. That was his mark, that Umar sent him just to be a teacher in Kufa, whereas everyone else from his generation was busied by things, so they weren't pure teachers in the same way that he was. That's why when Ali came, they say he was met by 4,000 scholars or Quran reciters, and he said, "May Allah bless Ibn Abd," which is Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, because he's filled the city with knowledge. So what's Sunnah now? It's the people who kept the closest company with these people. Because where's their knowledge come? It's coming from them. So once you get this idea, Sunnah was about sitting with people who sat with the Prophet ﷺ, and it could not be separated from the teachings of these people themselves, their answers to new questions. Because those answers came from a Sunnah, and all of it was therefore an object of study. Abu Hanifa is an inheritor of this early tradition. This is important, and the entirety of Hanafi fiqh is grounded on this idea, that he connects to Sunnah, which is its earliest idea, which is the company of the fuqaha, the great teachers who were renowned from the tabi'een, who sat with renowned teachers from the companions. That's very, very important. That's authoritative Sunnah. Something which is not known in these circles of the well-known teachers can't be a strong Sunnah. That's it. Somebody might say, I heard the Prophet say, ﷺ, such and such, with a chain. But if it wasn't known by the well-known teachers in the well-known towns who kept the well-known company, it can't be a very strong Sunnah. That's it. So as you can see then, the statements of the learned is how you know the Sunnah, not the chains of transmitters according to the early tradition, and Abu Hanifa is a representative of that. That's their answer to that first question. I'm going to come back to this firstly. Their answer to the second question, what's the role of the mind? Again, they have a very clear answer, and in many ways it's also representative of this early tradition. And it's very strange because there's a spectrum on how scholars have answered this question. On the one hand is what you can call maybe conservative is maybe not the best word, but a suspicious answer, which is that you have to restrict the activity of the mind, because otherwise the mind, when it gets involved, it will lead you into its own pathways. And the point is to let the revelation speak, not your mind. And so such schools of thought have theories of qiyas, analogy, textual interpretation, and so on. Like I said, many principles, all to reflect one idea: is how do you restrict the mind as much as you can into a set of rules so it works in a very controlled way, so it doesn't take over the process. That's not the answer which you can associate with Abu Hanifa's school. The answer associated with his school is quite the opposite, which is you have to open up your mind as much as you can, and you have to let it absorb the statements that have come from the Sunnah, and you have to do your best to understand the sense of everything, because that's the only way, or the most reliable way, that you can be true to it. Because if you don't do that, you're just dealing with words and simple equations. That's a very dry process. How do you know you're going to get the will of God through that? So if you want to know the will of God, you have to open up the mind as much as you can and really try your best to understand the why of everything, the sense of everything, as much as you can. And make a law that's faithful to that, because that's more likely to be closer to the truth. On the simple premise that the law of God is sensible, it makes sense to our minds. Our minds were created to live that law. That law was revealed to be lived by our minds. And so there's a form of harmony, but we have to learn. And so it's a very, what you can call a rational system. And that's what it's always been known for, right from the beginning. That's a summary then. Every school has an answer to these two questions. These are the fundamental ideas of thought in every school, and these are the simple answers I've given for Hanafi thought. What I want to present today is to prove further why these two are the basis of Hanafi thought, and to show you how the teaching texts which we study in our circles are fascinating stores of this thought system. If we approach it carefully and we understand its premises, they teach us something incredible. And so I hope that if someone here is a student of law, of Hanafi law or any other Islamic legal system, to understand that these are very profound systems and their texts are very meaning laden, but you have to know what you're looking for. And for people here who it's not their aspiration to undertake further study in this tradition or any other, then I hope just to enhance one thing perhaps, and that's love and respect. And I think that's meaningful for all of us. There's a statement attributed to Abu Darda radiyallahu anhu where he has reported to have said, "Kun aliman, aw muta'alliman, aw muhibban, aw muttabi'an, wa la takun al-khamis fatahlak." Be a scholar, or be a student, or be a lover, or be a follower. But don't do anything else, otherwise you're going to be doomed. This fits very nicely into our early picture now of early circles, because the Sunnah is only taken from the circles of scholars, and salvation from destruction is only in the Sunnah. So all you can do to succeed in life is you either be one of them as an expert, be one of them as a student, or at least love them, because if you love them, then you'll follow them and you'll still be saved. So it's nice to leave adjectives behind. I'm a Hanafi, what does that mean really? But to enter into a world where there's genuine respect, fascination, or gratitude to the many men who've passed on something which is quite remarkable, as I hope we'll get at least a small taste of, and ultimately gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who's allowed us in this time and this place and this land, and we feel so far away, to connect to something which is so ancient and so pristine, as we hope to get a taste of. Allahu a'lam. Good. What I want to present to you then are just some insights from two texts which I've been studying. One text is a text attributed to Abu Hanifa's student, Abu Yusuf, who died in the year 182 after Hijrah. The book is entitled Ikhtilaf Abi Hanifa wa Ibn Abi Layla. The differences between Abu Hanifa and Ibn Abi Layla. It's a very, very early text. You can't really call a Hanafi school in this period, except people who studied with Abu Hanifa. Abu Hanifa was Abu Yusuf's teacher. Ibn Abi Layla was Abu Yusuf's teacher before he started studying with Abu Hanifa. They're both great teachers of Kufa, so they're both from a local tradition. And what he does is, in this book, he gathers about 263 mas'alas, cases of law, in which they held different opinions. Two great teachers of Kufa, two contemporaries. And he adds sometimes a report or hadith they might quote to support their position. He sometimes adds a rational argument they might quote to show their position. And usually he'll present his preferred position. Usually with Abu Hanifa, but not always. So just a few markers from this text to drive home these two core ideas of Hanafi thought. And the second text is the one that Faisal mentioned, which is the Hidāyah of al-Marghīnānī, who died about 593 after Hijrah. And it's probably the most successful commentary of Hanafi law, which has been taught everywhere and commented on countless times. It's been taught here, so you get an idea of how successful it is. And I want to show how both of these two texts, which are separated by about 400 years, they're connected in a very beautiful and fascinating way. Good. So very briefly then, the first text. Abu Yusuf's Ikhtilaf Abi Hanif or Ibn Abi Layla. You can find it online, those who are interested. It was edited by a man called Abu al-Wafa al-Afghani, who was in Hyderabad in the early part of the 20th century, I believe. And he was trying very hard to publish early Hanafi texts, and this was one of them. And so you can find the PDF online of his publication. Well, what we can learn from this text, first of all, the text contains reports, authority figures who are quoted to prove why my position is good as opposed to the other. The reports are about 150 almost. Only 23 are from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, meaning 130 odd are from other figures. Who? Sahaba and Tabi'een. Why? To prove my original point. Sunnah is about those who have gone before. And these people were in a generation in which they considered everyone before them a bearer of something sacred. So that's already an important point, tying back to a wider teaching tradition, which you can't connect with simply from a hadith book. A hadith book has statements, correct, but there's more than that. The positions of those who are authority figures in transmitting those statements as part of the sunnah. This is the first thing. Okay, another thing. These 263 cases of law, I used other early sources as well to see which of those could I find a precedent for, i.e. early figures who have held these positions. Using two very well-known books which try to document early legal positions. One is the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba, who's a 3rd century author from Kufa. And one's the Musannaf of Abdul Razzaq as-San'ani, who is also a 3rd century author, who's from the Yemen, a teacher of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, so early sources. And I tried to just whatever masalas I found in Abu Yusuf's book, where do I find them in these books and who's holding these positions. So I found at least 100 very, without too much effort, and many more would have been early positions as well. What does that tell us straight away? Is that what Abu Yusuf is doing in documenting this book is how his two teachers have sifted through the sunnah of those who have gone before. Fiqh is not about brand new ideas, but it's how you've dealt with this tradition in very interesting ways. Good. Of these, I'd say 90 mas'alas, 90 cases, I found a clear precedent for both positions in each case. Of Abu Hanifa's one case and the opposing position of Ibn Abi Layla. So 90 cases where I can tell you right now, Abu Hanifa said X, Ibn Abi Layla said Y, and Abu Hanifa was preceded to the same position by so and so and so and so, and Ibn Abi Layla by so and so and so and so. So I got precedents on both sides. So I tried to see how loyal are they to their town. Are they trying very hard to follow the tradition which is local? Are they very free? And so on. And the general pattern was quite interesting, which is that, yes, they're deeply influenced by local tradition, because that's obviously where they've been studying. And that's the sunnah which they've spent the most time working with. So out of 90 cases, Abu Hanifa only left, i.e. adopted a position not previously adopted in Kufa, according to these limited sources, only 7 times. So that means out of 90 cases, then 83 times he would say something that somebody before him had said in Kufa already. Ibn Abi Layla had left Kufa about 19 times. And within Kufa, they would often adopt the positions of varying teachers. So what's the summary of this? What am I trying to convey? Is that the positions of Abu Hanifa that you study in your famous text, which you're studying today, you have to approach them as expressions of sunnah. That's a fundamental idea. You cannot bypass them somehow to arrive at the early teaching circles. This is a sifting through of the early teaching circles. It's a sunnah, it's sacred. Within these early circles, what did it mean to be a faqih in these early circles? What used to happen was as follows. They would spend a very long time with their teachers. Abu Hanifa spent about 18 years with his teacher Hammad. And that's very typical numbers, 18, 19, 20. This was the idea. Spend a long time in the circle of a particular teacher who you felt was somebody very well aware of these early traditions and positions of the jurists, and somebody with great insight into questions of law. And in that time you spent with them, you were meant to acquire that ability to reason and acquire this knowledge of all these early positions. But you weren't meant to follow that teacher. That was not an expectation that you simply narrate what the teacher held. And that's why in these positions, they would vary quite a great deal. Abu Hanifa sometimes with this early teacher, sometimes with the other. So the idea was you choose. But after you've learned this early repository of Sunnah, which is the positions of the great jurists who've come before, and you've developed an ability to reason through your company with a great jurist. Good. This book also contains arguments, rational arguments. Abu Hanifa criticizing the position of Ibn Abi Layla. These rational arguments, if you look at them, they fundamentally return to a simple idea, which you can call systematic reasoning or consistent reasoning. Because by this time, Abu Hanifa, a century has passed since the Hijrah, when Abu Hanifa was teaching in his circle, up until this time, there's been a great repository of legal answers now by Sahaba and by Tabi'een before Abu Hanifa. And so his generation, and he seems to be of the foremost of these, they're tying together, and obviously this has been happening before him as well. How do you create the most systematic set of rules, most consistent? Again, this premise that the law has to be sensible. Obviously, if you're inconsistent, then you haven't thought carefully enough about how you're answering questions. So a search for consistency is usually the main argument against someone. You said that there, you said that there, you obviously haven't thought well enough. It's gone. He'll say, no, but I have this tradition from so-and-so. And then you'll point, yeah, but so-and-so said the other thing. And that makes much more sense. And yours is not making sense right now. So this is the beginning of the two commitments, role of the mind and authoritative tradition. I'll give you some very simple examples of what I mean from this text. There's a mas'ala, sorry, I'll just get the words right as well. So there's a mas'ala in fiqh, which is if you sell a house to somebody, the neighbor has the right to take you to court and say, no, I'm going to buy it instead, because I'm the neighbor and I have the greatest right to buy the property that's next door to me. We call that shufa. The Hanafis affirmed this right. Other scholars didn't give it to the neighbor. Ibn Abi Layla obviously is from Kufa, and he also affirms this right. The debate came as follows. A man gives property as mahar to a woman, not as a sale. So a man wants to marry a woman, he says, yes, I'll marry you, and as my marriage payment to you, I'll give you my house. Yeah, lucky lady, the boy over here saying. Good. So Ibn Abi Layla said, yeah, there should be shufa in this. Meaning, the neighbor should be able to step in and say, hang on lady, I'm taking the house. I'll give you some equivalent money in exchange or something. You can see these questions. They had to think through related questions to think, what's the most consistent way to think about this topic? Otherwise, you haven't produced legal thought. You've just produced scattered sentences. And Abu Hanifa said, no, that's impossible. This is, shufa is only for sale. This is not a sale. Have you considered, what if he divorces her before consummating? Because in Islam, in the Quran, if you divorce a woman before consummating the marriage, she keeps how much? Not nothing. You give the house half the mahar. She keeps half the mahar. So what's going to happen now? So he gave her the mahar. The neighbor took it over. He divorced her. Now the neighbor's going to pay you for half. He's going to move out. Have you thought about that yet? This is the question. Again, consistent reasoning. You're inconsistent. Therefore, you haven't thought it out. Therefore, your statement can't be correct. Well, there's another case of divorce, which was there was a phrase. A man says to his wife, La hajata li fiki, I have no need for you. And he intends divorce. Does it count as divorce? So Ibn Abi Layla says, yeah, of course. And Abu Hanifa says, come on. He's arguing for consistency here, not in legal thought, but he's arguing for consistency, you can say, in conventional usage. He goes, no, hang on. Let's look at other phrases people might say. So he says, how can this be divorce when it's equivalent to, I don't desire you, I don't want you, I'm not infatuated with you, I don't love you. None of these are used by people to mean divorce. So how can I don't need you be something that could be used for divorce? Again, I'm not saying who's right and wrong, but I'm saying the kinds of arguments that are being conveyed are sometimes about consistent legal reasoning. Sometimes they're about human conventions, and to make sure you've thought them through carefully and not just on some abstract plane, distant from the way that people use legal statements, because obviously the law speaks to people. Sometimes they're practical ideas, and he's criticizing him for not being practically cautious. An example is that of a slave girl. She gets that's right, someone is claiming she's my runaway slave girl, and and some people come with a letter to the judge. Ibn Abi Layla says, yeah, the judge should send her off with them to the owner. And Abu Hanifa says, no. He goes, this doesn't seem like it's safe conduct. Have you considered, what if she's beautiful? What if the men are not trustworthy? This is not the way you should undertake this. This is a procedural question with practicalities in it. So, what you see then, an early text from Abu Hanifa's student, and this is illustrative of that tradition, that entire textual corpus that came out after Abu Hanifa, it's conveying this. It's conveying legal statements, it's conveying an understanding of how they're grounded in an early idea of sunnah that makes them sacred, and it's combined with a whole host of rational insights. Some are what you call legal, consistent reasoning. Some are what you'd call an interest in people's norms, in their usage of words and dealings, and some what you might call pragmatic, practical consideration. But each of these are underpinning these legal statements. Therefore, each of these are an avenue to arriving at Hanafi thought. The arguments are Hanafi thought. The legal statements convey the arguments. The legal statements are the doors to Hanafi thought, not just the thought itself. Good. How do we access this thought now? How do we access this sunnah, this sacred tradition? As students, we are far removed from those circles. And the idea of early sunnah became very unfashionable quite soon after Abu Hanifa. Why did Shafi'i become, so popular? Because he spoke against the early traditions. Again, he died 200, just after 200, so 50 years after Abu Hanifa, he died. But at that time, there's like 200 years of these oral traditions in this town, Shafi'i saying, well, how do you prove any of this? Because again, you're quite far from the sources now. And so Shafi'i says, no, this is unreliable now, which makes sense in his time. And he goes, let's use these hadith methods of the Ahlul Hadith as our way now to arrive at early tradition. That became quite popular. So Abu Hanifa was part of an early tradition, but as time went on, the memory became harder to prove. And that's why these later schools took on other methods. And it became quite fashionable. So the trick is, when the later methods are now, if you like, attacking the early methods, but the reasoning is embedded in those methods, we've come late now to this game. How do we access early tradition and early sunnah? And we access it fundamentally and primarily through what are the mukhtasars of law, the mutun, the fundamental texts which convey the key legal cases transmitted from Abu Hanifa's circle. The most famous and the greatest of these mukhtasars is the mukhtasar of al-Quduri, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, who died at about 423-ish, I believe, after the Hijrah, scholar from Iraq. His Mukhtasar became the model or the map of all the Mukhtasars of the Hanafi school. And you could argue it's the first real classical Mukhtasar of the Hanafi school. Previous ones weren't complete in the way that his was. His Mukhtasar is then chapters of law, very concise chapters of law, starting from purity and ending with wherever they end, perhaps in inheritance. And they go through all the questions of law. And where are these cases coming from? So Quduri doesn't derive these cases just from one or two books, famous books written by Muhammad. Rather, it's a synthesis of a huge corpus of early Hanafi writings. All sorts, famous books by Muhammad, which is Abu Hanifa's other well-known student, Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, who died 189 after the Hijrah. There's also less famous books of Muhammad. There's also various transmissions from Abu Yusuf. There's also books by Abu Hanifa's other student, Al-Hasan ibn Ziyad. All of these were sources. All of these are sources for the cases in Quduri's book. And so what does Quduri's Mukhtasar signify then? It's the first step of that early tradition, which was what? Bringing together a vast set of transmissions from this one teaching circle in Kufa, which is Abu Hanifa's circle, meaning his positions, the positions of his students, and sifting through them to arrive at what seemed to be the best core cases to be the basis of study. So it's similar to what Abu Hanifa's circle was doing, is it not? Again, Abu Hanifa's generation. How do you learn fiqh? Sit with a master, a vast set of transmissions from the early jurists. You develop the ability to reason, and you sift through them, and you produce your statements of law. They did something very similar to the corpus of Hanafi legal statements, to arrive at what seemed the most consistent, the most sensible, the most true to Hanafi thought of these various positions that were conveyed to them, and the strongest in transmission. Again, a mix of all of that is what made it to the core Mukhtasars. Quduri is a representative of that movement of the early Hanafi tradition into what you can call a classical, mature, settled tradition, which Quduri's Mukhtasar is almost the beginning of. That's all I'll say about Quduri's book right now. But why am I saying this? The reason why I bought this was just to point at it. As I told Faisal, I'm not going to read from it to you. I just wanted to point at it. This is a commentary. That's Quduri's text. It's normally the first text that's taught in most madrasas in the world. And it's the earliest one. Isn't that fascinating? I don't know how many schools of law do something like that. That right at the beginning you learn something that came right at the beginning. So it's not common. But it reflects his Hanafi interest in early Sunnah. The sacred is from the past. The sacred is a lived tradition which is gone. So this has to be approached as Sunnah. That's the most important thing for a student to understand. You approach these sentences and you sit before them like the Ahlul Hadith, or like we also, but would sit before Hadith books. Because not every Hadith is practiced according to all of the jurists. Some Hadiths they interpret away because it doesn't seem in line with other hadith that they feel are more worthy of practice. So just like in a hadith book, you might not practice every single hadith, but every single hadith is sacred. It's a sacred memory of the utterances of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. These masail that you study as a student right at the beginning of your Hanafi studies, they're sacred. They are like Bukhari to you. This is really important actually. This cannot be ignored. Because each of them will either be verbatim, i.e. exactly a legal case from a companion or a tabi'i that came before Abu Hanifa, which makes it sunnah, or it will be a new statement produced in Abu Hanifa's circle based on understandings, based on the study of those early cases. So it is an early statement from the Sahaba and the Tabi'een, or it's a statement produced to be in line with statements produced by the Sahaba and the Tabi'een. And what's fascinating in the core Hanafi Mukhtasars is that everybody after Abu Hanifa's circle is silent. Very few, we can call them negligible cases that you will study in your studies came after Abu Hanifa. That's fascinating as well. I don't know how many schools will have this feature, but it reflects this insight into sacred sunnah. Abu Hanifa is a representative, an inheritor of something sacred, and we take law from those who are early. That's the circle we're taking the fiqh from. And so your basic study is not about what came later. What came later is important, but that comes elsewhere. The basic study is what went before. That's fascinating, and that's why this is a sacred engagement. What's the engagement for? This is very important now, because if all your study is law produced in the 2nd century in Kufa, half of which were statements maybe from the 1st century or very early 2nd century, what's it got to do with you here? So the goal of study can't be memorizing. The goal of study is something. That something is called fiqh. So what's fiqh? Fiqh, we translate it, and it's very, very important also to understand that. Fiqh means deep understanding. That's important. What does fiqh mean in the Hanafi tradition? Oh, because every thought system has an idea of what they're trying to achieve. The Hanafis consider themselves fuqaha par excellence, and what I mean by that is in their book, sometimes they'll say the fuqaha say, and they just mean themselves. And the others are a group, but fuqaha is like a label for them. Fiqh is their thing. And it's interesting, even Shafi'i is reported to have said, الناس في الفقه عيال على أبي حنيفة, أو كما قال, that when it comes to fiqh, this art, this craft, yeah, they're all dependent on him. Meaning he's the one that was really key in this systematic thought that brought together the chapters of law. A fascinating and a very important, I think, and very helpful definition of fiqh from a Hanafi point of view is found in the usul work of Abu Yusr al-Bazdawi, who's a 5th century Central Asian Hanafi scholar. He died close to 480, 490. He says, الفقه هو العلم بما علق به الأحكام الشرعية المودع في كتاب الله تعالى وسنة رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم وإجماع الأمة. And he spends about 2 pages to explain exactly what he's trying to say. Or maybe 3. He says, fiqh is a knowledge of that from which legal statements found in the Quran and Sunnah or Ijma are suspended by. Okay, we have to think about what this means. Suspended by is very odd, so I translate it as underpins instead. It's the opposite metaphor, but I think it makes sense in English. Fiqh is a knowledge not of the legal statement. It's very explicit. If you memorize Quduri, you're not a faqih. You will never be a faqih. You won't be close to being a faqih by memorizing law. He's explicit on that. More than that, and he's quite clear as well. Memorizing the Quran and Sunnah statements from which these legal statements come will not make you a faqih. That's not fiqh for us. It's a given that you should know these things, but you're not one of us yet. Fiqh is to look at those legal statements themselves and to understand what it is that's underpinning them, what it is that's upholding them. If you like, why it is that they work. And he gives these, so fiqh is that knowledge of an idea. And he says this idea, you could call it ma'na, the real meaning of that legal statement. He says you could call it illah, the thing that brings the legal statement about. You could call it sabab or cause. You could call it hikmah. You could call it fiqh as well. You could call it hujjah. You could call it qiyas. You could call it nadhr. Contemplation, reflection. That's fiqh. So what does it mean to be a student of Hanafi thought? Is you sit before the statements, which are bearers of 2 things, a sunnah and an idea, a meaning, a rational meaning, an understanding of why things work the way that they do. The legal cases are the bearers of Hanafi thought. And you have to go through them systematically, case by case, by case, by case, by case. And in every one, you have to reflect on, why is it the way that it is? What is the insight being conveyed? That has been the hallmark of Hanafi commentaries right since the beginning. Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani radiallahu anhu, he wrote a book called al-Jami' al-Saghir, very, very small book. Nothing but a few set of legal masalas, that's it. It probably is Islam's first ever legal mukhtasar, a small digest of legal rules, nothing else. No arguments, no hadiths, just legal rules organized by books. You know, Kitab of Salat, Kitab of Hajj, and so on. And the cases in them are very few, and they're very ghareeb, like odd cases. So when he talks about wudu and tahara, in fact all of tahara I think, are only 3 mas'alas of what breaks wudu, and they're funny ones. Like a worm coming out of a wound, maybe vomiting blood, and a third one, I don't recall. So they're not normal masalas. How do you do wudu and the basics? They're all odd masalas. No explanation, no hadiths, no sunnah, no nothing. And this book was kind of like an earthquake in its time, because it was the beginning of legal writing as a genre, law. And not just that. Why were these cases presented in the first place? Because they represented what? Questions. Every case of law, what do we call it in a fiqh book? What do we call it? This is a mas'ala. Good, I used to think it was masala when I first read it. I didn't know what they were talking about. Mas'ala is the word used. Mas'ala, the fara'id of wudu are 4. Mas'ala, wudu breaks by wind passing. Mas'ala, every case, mas'ala. Mas'ala in Arabic means question. It does not mean answer. What was Abu Hanifa doing in his circle that was really ahead of his time, which is clear from the legal cases? It was the questions he was asking. What's quite fascinating in his circle, they weren't simply asking or answering basic questions. What's wudu, what's not wudu, what's this and what's not that. But what if a worm comes out of the rear? And it might sound funny, but the question is trying to bring out a few ideas. Is it the alien body? Is it natural substances that should break wudu? Or is it the exit? Is it a little bit? And so on, through all the questions of law. His questions are astounding. That somebody, just after 100 years after the Prophet ﷺ, is asking these kinds of questions, chapter by chapter, chapter by chapter, chapter by chapter, into the intricacies of wakalas and gifts and buying and selling and riba and travel and trade. That's where the fiqh lies. It's in the questions. So the Jami' al-Saghir, little law book, Mukhtasar of Muhammad, was an earthquake in its time because it was a digest of legal questions. Which means, how is it studied? Only in a circle, not by learning it as legal statements, but entering into the world of those questions. What's this worm of the rear mas'ala supposing? Oh, what breaks wudu? Is it the egg? Is it not the egg? You have to enter a whole discussion now. That's why people were fascinated by this book. The Ahlul Hadith were taken aback by it. Again, Ahlul Hadith are like another camp in this period. People who are very cautious about the mind in any capacity. Very great figures of Ahlul Hadith were studying this book. Yahya ibn Ma'in, who's a radiallahu anhu, great Imam of Jarh wa Ta'dil, a companion of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. He studied this book with Muhammad ibn Hassan. Yahya bin Sa'id al-Qattan radiallahu anhu is a great Imam of Hadith. One generation earlier, he studied this book with Abu Yusuf. Ahmad, his early studies were with Abu Yusuf, and he probably would have studied this text, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Ahmad, one of his students, I believe it's Za'farani, he asked Ahmad, please give us permission to learn this book with them so we can delve into the law, the legal thought with them. And Ahmad wasn't fond of that, and he said, no, just isbir, just have patience. I mean, I know it's exciting. I know that world is fascinating, but hold yourself back, just stick to the hadiths. So as you can see, from the beginning, Hanafi thought was embedded in legal cases. The legal cases, their brilliance was the questions. And that's why in Abu Hanifa's circle, the circle had many positions. Abu Hanifa, they were not writing down, they were not transmitters of his law. Unlike what seems to be, actually maybe not always, I'll hold my comment back about Malik's circle. You get the impression more that they were transmitters of his law, and they had obviously their own positions. But in Abu Hanifa's circle, it was a setting of jurisprudence. They raised the question. As long as they engage with the questions, they will develop systematic thought. And on some cases they'll agree with Abu Hanifa, on some cases they won't. But that's how he was with his teachers, that's how they were with him. That's why his school presents a number of positions on the questions of law. Good. So the objective of fiqh right from the beginning has not been about learning the cases alone, but delving into their world. And it's a rational world, it's a world that's aimed for consistency, clear ideas. It aims for knowledge of the world and practicalities. And it's all embedded right there, simply in the mas'alas. Good. The Hidāyah is not special in that regards, meaning if the Hanafis had the Hidāyah or they didn't have the Hidāyah, it's not really bringing a new idea. The ideas have been as ancient as Abu Hanifa's circle, and I'm saying they are ancient as before his circle as well. Every commentary, every line of commentary, from the beginning of the earliest commentaries on Muhammad's books to the commentaries on Quduri and those that came after, their fundamental interest is answering the question of why for every case. Why does it work this way? If it's different from another case that should have been similar, why is it different? And as you go through the whys, you build up a set of ideas. What's the logic of this chapter? As well as a set of exceptions which I'll be coming to shortly. The Hidāyah then, I'm not going to answer to you why it was as successful as it was. That's something that needs to be looked into. But what I will say is it's representative of what all the other books were doing. But it's fascinating only because it's the one that we all study. You know, the Madaris in the UK, Darul Ulum, it's their main text that they reach towards. When you've got it, then you're meant to have got it. And I'm saying it's conveying something far richer than we might appreciate. Before I come to that, let me give you an idea of what I mean of systematic thought and reasoning and the brilliance of the questions. It's a simple idea of the rules of prayer. I.e., the mukhtasar is what's brilliant. That's it. Whether it's this commentary or another commentary, they'll all do similar things. They'll try to answer the question of why. Yes, some authors, their whys seem stronger than other authors. Some authors stood out in the tradition because they were clearly seen as being geniuses. Whereas other authors were good, but not as. This is true. But they're attempting something very similar in every commentary, but the brilliance actually is right up here. It's in the questions. Look at the cases of prayer. You get an idea of what I mean of the brilliance of their theorizing. What are the arkan of salat? The most obligatory things, the essential. Again, Abu Hanifa's circle were very keen to figure out, to theorize things. What are the essentials of prayer? And the things that build upon that. The essences of legal ideas were very important to them. That's why the essentials are always very minimalistic. He's always trying to think, what's the basis of this act? And the other thing, no, it supports it, but it's not basic to it. So the basics of prayer, the real essentials that make a prayer are 5 things for them. What are the 5? This is a test. Am I allowed to test?
Entering into the prayer takbir.
Okay, takbir is tricky. They debated. Look at that. They debated. Everyone knows to say takbir, but they were thinking theoretically. This thing called takbir, is it prayer or is prayer something that takes place after it? You can think that's a funny question, but they do that throughout everything in the law. Think really hard. What's its relationship to essence? Muhammad said it's prayer. Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf, I believe, they said no. It's the thing you do in which you enter into the state of someone who prays. Like ihram for hajj. Ihram's not hajj. It's a thing you do to enter into a state in which you are now able to stand before God, before which you can't. It's the door to prayer. It's not prayer itself. But as you can see, that involves a particular commitment to the role of the mind. That's what I mean. So the 5 are after that. What comes after that? Okay, so what they called was something called standing.
Qiyam.
Yeah, good. Something called reciting Quran.
Ruku.
Something called bowing, ruku'. Something called prostrating, sajda. Something called a final sitting, before which you can exit the prayer. They only made them 5. They have a fascinating topic, because again, it's the questions. They had to think really hard, what is this thing called prayer? A theory. How does it work? What's the relationship of bowing to prostrating to standing? How do they relate to this thing called salat? What's the purpose of salat? They don't share this philosophy with you, but they ask some key questions to convey key aspects of the philosophy. But you can tell from the mas'alas, they have to come up with a complete philosophy of prayer. And you can arrive at it if you study the mas'alas. Good. There's a mas'ala in Kitab Salat al-Marid, where they try to clash a few of these cases to show you what they believe is the essence of prayer. So let's look at this. First of all, before we come to Salat al-Marid, reciting Quran, they say you must recite some Quran, otherwise you haven't prayed. But they talk about the ummi, the one who doesn't know anything. That's it, one who never memorized any Quran. What do they say? Then it's fine, he doesn't have to read Quran. So this one drops from ignorance. Good. Let's go to now Salat al-Marid. Everyone agrees, if you can't pray standing because you're sick, you can pray sitting. So standing drops. It's an integral, but it can drop. And the thing called prayer can continue. They all agree, if you can't pray sitting, what do? Pray lying. Okay. Sitting as a posture is not always necessary. It can go as well. We all agree to that. They asked a fascinating question. Look at this now. Look at this. The question was this. Let's say you're able to stand, but due to whatever ailment in your back or whatever else, you're not able to prostrate on the ground. What's the best thing to do? Signals is fine, but from where? This was the question. No, you're not paralyzed. You just can't put your forehead on the ground. And you're able to stand. What did they say? It's really interesting. They said, fine, if you wanted to, just stand and do your motions from standing. But what's best is that you sit. Forget standing now. Just sit and do your motions from sitting. Why?
Sitting, you can do sujood.
But you can't. This person can't. So this person will sit and do the motions from sitting. So it's funny. If you want to look at these two rational methods, like I said. One is to remove the mind. Remember I said that? Leave it to a process. What's a simple process? Standing is an integral, reciting and prostrating is an integral. You can't do one, you can do four. That's it, you have to do four. That's one way of being rational. That's not the Hanafi way. That's not Abu Hanifa's way. What's his way is, no four things are equal. What's the relationship of standing to prayer? And his answer from this case is what?
If you sit, you can do an upright and halfway.
Well, you can do that from standing, upright and halfway. So what's the difference? Anyone else? Close to what?
The ground.
That's it. That's it. It's closer to the ground. If you look at this case, what's it conveying? It's conveying a few things. It's conveying that the central act of prayer, in terms of the physical posture, is putting your forehead on the ground. That's the essence of salat. Which conveys something. The essence of salat is al-khudu', is to be totally humble before Allah. That's it. It's something you can see. It's a ritual to humble yourself before Allah. Its soul therefore is sajda, which is the only position that's repeated in every cycle. What's standing? Standing is a very respectful way to address someone. This is true. That's why you recite in standing. Okay, then you go into bowing. That's an initial expression of humility. And then you stand. In this standing, there's nothing important to recite or Quran. There's a sunnah dhikr. So why do you do this second standing before you prostrate? Why? Yeah. So you can fall into the prostration. What's fascinating is in the Quran, when the Quran speaks of prostration, it speaks of falling into prostration. Kharra sajidan, not just sajada. Because if I'm already sitting down and I just roll over a bit, it's rather convenient for me. I haven't done full belittling of myself, but rather I'm standing and I fall before someone in prostration. So in terms of the postures alone, standing is a means to fall into prostration. Prostration is the heart of the prayer. And if you're not able to prostrate, standing is fine, but Surely it's more humble to be just on the ground. And that's the heart of the prayer. Can you see how this is a particular commitment to the role of the mind? It's being conveyed by a simple question. If you dwell on the question for a few minutes, you enter a world of a theory of prayer and theory of the mind. Every masala does that. As it does that, your mind is entering into another world of another set of minds. That's legal training. The bab goes on, it's fascinating. They say, what if the guy's paralyzed? They answer this question, he can't move anything. They had a very fascinating question. People talk about the eyes and things, but the Hanafis were quite physical here. They said, oh, there's no salat for him. That's it, he just has to wait. If he can ever move it again, then he can pray and make those prayers up, otherwise not. Meaning, by all means, use your eyes and do dhikr and do Qur'an, but salat is a particular ritual whose fundamental minimum is you move, its real essence is putting your forehead on the ground. If you can't do that, it's to motion with your forehead, that at least you're lowering yourself, you're humbling yourself. And if you can't do that, then you can't do this thing called prayer. I'm sorry, just do something else. Scholars can answer this many ways. The mind can go in many ways to answer this. But they're conveying something, a theory of prayer. It's a physical act of humility before Allah, and it's to do with lowering yourself. But you can make a spiritual theory out of this, can't you? Look at the other cases. One more thing, the conditions before prayer. There's about 5 of them. You know, the time has to be in, and you should be facing the Qibla. Your clothing and body and place shouldn't have physical najasa or filth on it. You should be in physical purity. You've done wudu or ghusl as required. You know what prayer, you know that you're praying and which prayer you're praying. And you've said Allahu Akbar to enter into the prayer. Good. If you go through the cases, again, they will produce scenarios, they produce questions in which they'll drop some of these one by one. If you're afraid or you don't know, that's okay. Just face the direction you're able to face. Qibla drops. And it makes sense why it drops. Because the direction is not intrinsic to the act of prayer, but rather it's an act of respect to the house of God and a unity with believers. So it's still one step removed from the ritual, and it drops. Clothing is important. If you don't have any, it drops. And they don't even say wait till you get clothing. They just say, if someone really has nothing, then just pray naked where you are. And there they clashed the question. They said, but is it better to pray standing while naked or pray sitting? They said, well, sitting is more concealing of the main respectful parts. Again, so as you can see throughout, it's not a blind equation, drop, keep. Every single one is thought about. How does it relate to the essence and the meaning of prayer? Each and every one of them. And they all dropped. But there's one that they didn't accept to drop, the other scholars did. And that's purity. They couldn't picture prayer without some act of cleansing yourself. That's it. That's a particular reasoning about what is the prayer. And from this, we can make a nice spiritual lesson out of what we've just said. How do you do that? Because they had to theorize, what is the act of prayer? It's to be in the presence of Allah and to lower yourself. That's it. Everything is building on that. How do you enter the presence of Allah? Okay, you say Allahu Akbar. But you have to be befitting for that presence. And you are a filthy creature. Who are you to prostrate there? You don't belong there until you clean yourself. And they could not accept a prayer, they could not imagine ritual prayer without purity. They could imagine it without clothes, if you just don't have anything. They could imagine it without direction. They could imagine it with filth. I'm covered in vomit and urine. They say, fine. If you can't move it, then just pray. Don't even delay it past the time if you can't clean it. Just pray. They could imagine it after time. They could imagine in all of these. But they couldn't imagine for them that you could pray without purifying yourself. That's a commitment. They had to have a theory of prayer. So can you see that? The mas'alas are enough. You don't need a big commentary. The mas'alas are brilliant. And they're ancient. And they're from that circle. And if you sit on them one by one, they'll enter you into a world which is fascinating. They will force you. They'll give you the courage to ask questions. Right now you're scared to ask because they ask those questions. You'd be scared. What's the relationship of standing to prostration? Oh, let standing go, just sit down. You'd be scared to ask the question, let alone propose the answer. But those who came before, i.e. before Abu Hanifa, they had the courage to ask these questions. And that courage is embedded in these mas'alas. That's why in the class of fiqh, you ask any question you want. And you propose any possible answer, not an answer you can tell the world maybe, but in the class, you think through it. That makes more sense. This makes less sense. That's more consistent. That's the dars. That's Hanafi thought in a classroom as it's been from the earlier circles. And that's why the training is always with these basic texts and books of argument. And it does it case by case. Good. Just a few more minutes and then we'll stop because I think we've gone on. 5 minutes, inshallah. What books like the Hidāyah convey, in addition to giving you an understanding of why every statement of law is sensible and consistent with every other, for every case of the book, they also give you fascinating insights where they're relevant, of how the law interacts with particular spheres. One of them is science, natural science. In the olden days, in the old world, before our modern world, natural science was a branch of philosophy. So who are the people dealing with biology and chemistry and substances? It's the same people dealing with where did the world come from? And what's the purpose of life anyway? It was a field of their knowledge. It wasn't someone else doing science and not dealing with the big questions. Fiqh, according to the fuqaha, according to the Hanafi certainly, fiqh is synonymous with hikmah. Hikmah is what they used for philosophy. And fiqh, as we've seen now in this simple example, they're really philosophizing a lot, theorizing the meaning of everything about human actions and dealings. So natural science fits in within their knowledge as well. And the commentators really tease out how science and fiqh are meant to interact through very, very simple cases. I'll give you only a few examples, but they're quite consistent here. They're not just throwing in the science just to make it look strong. They're really showing you how all the meanings are meant to work. There's one case of does entering water into the male private part, if you were able to enter water into there, should it break the fast? Abu Hanifa says no, Abu Yusuf says yes, and Muhammad is somewhere in the middle, they say, either with one or the other. When he explains this in the Hidāyah, he explains this only as a question of biology. It's got nothing, and he explains explicit, هذا ليس من الفقه. He says that. It's not from fiqh, by the way. It's not reasoning here. It's that Abu Yusuf assumed that the water that comes out from urine, it's coming out from your insides. There's a passageway through. And Abu Hanifa is assuming, his understanding is there's some kind of barrier through which water can permeate out, but things don't go in. And he's explicit, هذا ليس من الفقه. And what does he mean by that? That by all means, if you have an answer, follow that answer. It's not they're just conveying how the law relates to that question. And they do that a lot. The nature of vomit, the nature of phlegm, the nature of leather, the nature of swords, nature of mirrors, the properties of the feces of animals and the natures of urines, natures of things, which is part of science. They use that a lot to say, this position is stronger than that one. And sometimes they ignore science in places where clearly they could have gone, but they don't want the law to revolve around that. A woman's menstrual period, they use science there, but not when they talk about 3 to 10 is the average. Because they don't want a woman to have to consult some doctor every month to figure out the science of something. They say, forget the science here. They don't bring science into it. They say, no, this is tradition and you practice it. Because that's more practical. Whereas other questions, they bring science into it. Shafi'i says a pregnant woman can menstruate. And they say, no, she can't because the womb is closed in pregnancy. Science, it is not fiqh. They're saying, he might have some rational proof, but the science is against that, full stop. So we're right. They bring science in a lot, but not always. And they balance it with the law in fascinating ways. That's enough for you to run with a lot if you're concentrating in their books. They bring social practice into it a lot. What's normal for people? And they keep theorizing it. A very funny masala, what must a husband provide his wife from her maintenance? Is it one slave or two to serve in the house? I can't remember which way the khilaf goes. In Abu Hanifa's circle, some say one and some say two. And he answers to defend the people who say one. They say, well, I think it's Abu Yusuf says two, I think. And they say, yeah, because she needs two because, they can always give a why. Why is it sensible? Two is sensible because she needs one to help out in the house and one to help out outside the house. And the answer again says, no, there's no need for two because one can do inside and outside work. So one is enough. It's comical. But what they're conveying therefore is, don't get stuck with one and two. What you have to figure out is, how are needs going to be met? If you can't make that jump, they're not doing fiqh with these books. And that's all the commentary will be interested in. Case after case, norms of people are being conveyed. The book will also convey fascinating cases of how this ancient law of Abu Hanifa might need to be changed because of its own logic. Many cases like that. For example, there's this masala of, gold and silver. These are considered money, and exchanging them unequally is considered a usurious transaction, riba, haram. So if I can't exchange one gold coin for two gold coins, that's riba, haram. What's the definition of a gold coin? Again, a rational idea. It should at least be 50% gold. 50% is treated as all. Less than 50% is not treated as gold as all. They consistently apply this throughout the law. In zakat as well, jewelry that's less than 12 karat gold, there's no zakat. We don't really call it gold. The Hidāyah explains the logic, the sensibleness of all that, but then he says, but our teachers, when it comes to our coins, and they had this currency they used, they called them adlis and ghatrifis, particular coins of gold and silver that are quite impure, but they were used as the main currency. And he said, our scholars don't give fatwa based on this position because it's the only currency that we use. And if you open this door for unequal exchange, you open the door for riba then. So what did he do? He didn't change the law of Abu Hanifa and kept it in the book. He defended it, explained it, the sense of it, because that's the legal training of fiqh and sunnah. But then he's teaching you how it works. He goes, no, but hang on, this doesn't work anymore. Because they wouldn't have allowed it, because riba is this other principle. He does it throughout the book, obviously less frequently, but he does it enough that it's frequent enough that he's teaching you a lot. Many examples of that. Good. I'm going to stop here. It's a very big topic, but all I've hoped to have conveyed is that Hanafi thought is a fascinating transmission that takes you in this time and place into a very early circle. A very early, you belong there now. You're thinking there now. You're transmitting from there now. This entryway is what it means to be a student of this discipline. When you're a student of this discipline, then you can start thinking about questions of law. Before that, you can't. Because you're not even a member of this thought school. How are you going to talk about what should and shouldn't be done? I've not talked about law today. I've not talked about the madhab as an institution that's going to produce the strongest position, the position that should be followed. That's another dynamic. But to be part of that conversation, you have to be a scholar of fiqh. And these are books of fiqh. And to understand their premises is what it means to enter into them. So I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to reward on our behalf all of those who've come before, who've left behind this incredible wellspring, that we in this very odd and distant time and place can enter into this altogether different universe. We can dwell it. It can dwell within us. And it creates within us this fascinating capacity to ask, to question, to reason, to think, and to live. And the truth is, even if you're not going to be a scholar, this study helps you live. Because each of you has to think through questions of law, whether you like it or not. Whether you're a scholar or not. No scholar will be there with you when you think through what's right. This gives you a discipline of thought to think through what's right. That's why it's powerful for all of us. And yes, we need an elect group who really imbue this thought to then create a school of law, to produce law based on that. But the beginning is this. وصلى الله تعالى على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين. جزاكم الله خيرا.
Jazakallah khair. Can we open it up for questions?
Yeah, whatever. That's fine.
I think that's...
So you mentioned earlier on about negations of the prayer, basically, of what was really required, and you mentioned about purity, how that was essential basically for the prayer. But what happens for a situation where maybe somebody's got some sort of disability or something, where mentally they're okay, physically they're partially okay, but they can't make wudu themselves, for example? What would happen in that kind of situation?
Yeah, this is a very fascinating question because it ties together a number of principles. So the question is, what if someone has Yarhamakallah. So there's somebody who rationally, they're all sane, but physically they are impaired, and so they're unable to do wudu themselves. What should they do? The easy answer is, if there's somebody that can do wudu for them, they can help do their wudu, wash their limbs, and then they can pray. If that's difficult, if there's some way for them to do tayammum just on a rock, on any dry substance, and they can wipe their faces and arms, or someone can do that for them, then they can pray as well. And if there's no one there, then there's no prayer. I mean, that's the basic legal answer. Others have said further things, like, well, they can pretend to pray. It's as if they're praying. They do the dhikr of prayer and so on. But the basic question is, this is not that ritual prayer called salat, according to the fuqaha. Why do I say it's a fascinating question? Because it ties into another debate in Abu Hanifa's circle. And it's a general philosophy or theory of Abu Hanifa about legal agency. And it's really fascinating. And you can tie it into particular ideas of self-respect as well. Meaning, the religion is asking you to lower yourself before Allah. But it's not asking you to lower yourself before anybody else. That's quite important for Abu Hanifa, actually. So he says, for example, you don't have to beg people for water if you don't have any. Just do tayammum. And the companions say, no, it's good to ask because people normally give. Can you see that? It's a debate on what's normal and debate on, is it from the essence of worship that it forces you to be lower in front of people? No, it's just about you and Allah. Between people, maintain your respect. You have to ask them for their help. Worship is what you're able to do, and stop. So they debated this, but the later school preferred this position of his students. They said, no, if you're in a place where no one's going to put you down for asking or treat you like a beggar, because water is an easy thing to share, then by all means ask, and then you should ask. So this was a tricky thing. Okay, what's the other related case? Again, a blind man. Does he have to ask someone to take them to the mosque? Abu Hanifa says no, he can't do it, then he can't do it. Why does he have to rely on other people to worship? The worship is only between him and Allah. It's a consistent principle for him. It goes into your question. Does somebody need to ask somebody else to do wudu for them? The answer is no. Wudu is between you and Allah. You do what you can, you leave what you can't. Why do you have to ask other people to do all these acts for you? The companions, though, his students, were of the opinion, well, if it's somebody who it's easy for them, like a spouse, I don't know if there's a servant women to do things like that anymore, but someone that's very close, they wouldn't find it difficult to wash your limbs and wash your feet, and you wouldn't find it difficult to ask, then they said, then really you should, and the later school preferred this idea. But can you see, even on a simple question, before you get to the answer, the books want you to think about the different ways it could be thought about and why it's sensible. And the idea of self-respect is quite powerful. Should you buy water if you don't have any? They say, yeah, but don't let anyone rip you off. And they all say that, hands down. So let's say water is £1, and somebody knows you're a Muslim and you need water for your prayer. They say, okay, I'll make it £2. £2 is nothing, you've got £50 in your pocket. Fuqaha say, don't lower yourself, let someone take advantage of you for the prayer, leave it, just do tayammum. So can you see how much about life they're teaching you just in their questions? And they all agreed to this one. Don't let anyone rip you off, even if it's easy. And the only debate was about asking, and for wudu, they said, if it's somebody that it's not difficult for you to ask and for them to do, then what the school preferred was that you ask. Although Abu Hanifa said there's no need to, because that's not you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
If there's a pregnant pause, I'll ask one if that's okay.
I said pregnant with a question.
I'm sure.
Because in the fiqh, the questions go everywhere. I said the questions are the fun thing. And they go everywhere.
Kind of explained the mas'ala as sort of almost usuli principles.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that's fair? And then, okay, so
Yeah.
the question is this
Yeah.
then.
Possible.
So we went through Hisham Kamali's book and sort of covered, urf and balwa and how fiqh changes over time, and the various usuli principles. So how do we did that come, so that in terms of frame of reference, where does that fit in, and how do we contextualize that?
Yeah, so this is very fascinating as well. In this genre called usul al-fiqh, or legal principles, legal theory, historically, classically, they've generally considered there to be two methods of authorship in this genre: the method of the jurists and the method of the theologians. طريقة الفقهاء وطريقة المتكلمين. طريقة الفقهاء is the Hanafi way, and طريقة المتكلمين is everybody else's way. That's the simple summary, although later on people try to merge and do interesting things. But as a basic idea, Hanafis never theorized law away from the cases of law, ever. Because every individual case is an entry into a system of thought. It's bearing its own set of ideas and principles. So whether you call them qawa'id fiqhiyya, whether you call them maqasid shari, whatever you want to label the various forms of rational principles, you're going to find them within the cases. And that's how they've theorized it. So even the genre of usul al-fiqh for the Hanafis is very closely tied to the legal cases. The wider genre of usul al-fiqh, associated most with Shafi'i, but became the most general type of writing, which is most of the books that we study now, short works in usul al-fiqh. They're a nice grading of abstract principles. How to approach texts, how to approach sunnah, a process of qiyas, and they're distant from the cases.
Sorry, battery died, I think.
Yeah.
I'll just carry on though, yeah?
Yeah.
Everyone heard me. They are distant from the cases. And because of that, at least in a Hanafi thought system, you can't do much with them until you've approached them with the cases. And that's how Hanafi usul has always been understood. That's why Hanafis, interestingly, although they've been counted amongst the first to author books in qawa'id fiqhiyya, abstract principles of thinking about the law, when this genre really took off in a mature way in about the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries of Islam, they were the latest to author in them. They weren't the first. And the reason was because for them, fiqh has only ever been about such forms of principles, rational ideas about agency, about worship, about whatever the topics are. They're just embedded in the commentaries, and that's where they've always learnt them and taught them and imbued them. So that's all I've said. I've taken a roundabout answer. So all I'll say is yes, you can abstract from the commentaries, from the Hanafi usul works, which are kind of commentaries in another organization. You could abstract from them just a set of abstract principles, and some books have done that. And these are good as entryways for particular understandings of Hanafi thought, and maybe a more detailed way than we presented today. But to actually be able to use them, manipulate them, imbue them, work with them, reason with them, it's always been understood you do it with the cases. and not removed from them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alam. Otherwise, in this wider tradition, what I can call the non-Hanafi usul tradition, it's very distinct. There's two fields. One's called usul al-fiqh. It's a theoretical field. You learn about Qur'anic interpretation, you learn about hadith. So it's separate from a question of law. And the question of law, you learn it through law books. And then in between, if you want to propose something new, sure, you use those principles to defend your argument. But there is a barrier of sorts, enough that people endlessly are questioning what's the relationship. Does usul lead to fiqh? Is usul separate from fiqh? Because there is a barrier. It's not clear how the two fields are relating, although both are important and useful for study. In the general Hanafi world, they're all together, because each of them are exploring similar cases with different investigations. But to go to your first statement, yes, in one sense, all of these are usul. My teacher, Dr. Salah al-Hajj, he says there's three types of usul in fiqh. One he calls usul istinbat, principles to extract law. Those are principles that you'd associate with usul al-fiqh books. How to deal with Quranic language, how to deal with hadith transmission, and so on. The other one, which are the fundamental usul in commentary works and in the story I've been giving today, are called usul, what he calls usul al-bina, the usul of construction. And what it means by that is the ideas around which topics of fiqh have been constructed. Again, what's the meaning of prayer? What's the essence of marriage? What's the meaning of divorce? Shufa is for a sale, it's not for a marriage. These ideas of law and fiqh books, they call them the asl. They say asl Abu Hanifa is this. It's not about anything to do with Quran and Sunnah extraction, just a rational idea through which he understands this topic. They call that the asl. That's the fundamental training, I said, of fiqh. These are also usul, and they're called usul in this tradition, but not usul in that idea. Usul bina, usul of constructing a legal mind or a legal case. And the last one he calls, last category, usul al-tatbiq, principles for application, which are also embedded within the commentaries. I'm not aware of any real Hanafi tradition of separating them from commentaries, although that's what we're all dying to do in our time and age. But they're all embedded. And what are they? Changing of law for urf, which they do frequently. Changing of law for common practice, which is similar to ta'amul. Changing of law, less so I've seen the Hidāyah as a need for change, for taysir, for making easy. Changing of law for darura, for necessity, and so on. These are principles, again, an abstract set of principles embedded in the commentary for another purpose. They're purely for the purpose of application. And you find them all embedded in these. But they are all worthy of being called usul, but each at its own level. Allahu A'lam.